Imagine a single decision that quietly reshapes a nation's future for the next 50 years. Not through speeches, not through elections, but through a signature on a defense contract. Canada is standing at exactly that moment. On the surface, it looks like a routine military purchase. 88 fighter jets, billions of dollars, years of debate. But beneath that surface, something far bigger is unfolding. This choice isn't really about aircraft. It's about power, control, and whether Canada decides to remain comfortably aligned or deliberately independent in a world that's becoming less predictable by the year. For decades, the assumption has been clear. Canada buys American. Canada flies alongside Washington. Canada stays inside the system it helped build, and that's why most observers believe the outcome is already decided. The F-35, the safe option, the expected option, the option no one gets fired for choosing. But quietly, behind closed doors, another scenario has been taking shape. One that forces an uncomfortable question into the open. When security and sovereignty start pulling in different directions, which one really comes first? Canada isn't choosing between two jets. It's choosing between two philosophies. The first path is familiar. The F-35 represents continuity, alignment with Washington, deep integration with U.S. command, structures through NORAD and NATO. Lockheed Martin promises stealth, advanced sensors, and seamless interoperability with American forces. On paper, it's the logical move. The aircraft is already flying with allies. The supply chains are established. The political relationships are tested. This is the path of predictability. But predictability comes with strings attached. The F-35 is not just an aircraft. It's an ecosystem controlled from the outside. Software updates, mission systems, weapons integration, even certain maintenance functions remain under tight U.S. oversight. Countries don't fully own these jets in the traditional sense. They operate them within a framework defined elsewhere. As long as political relations are smooth, this isn't a problem. But defense planners don't plan for perfect relationships. They plan for stress, uncertainty, and worst-case scenarios. That's where the second path enters the conversation. Sweden's Gripen E isn't marketed as the most invisible jet in the sky or the most expensive piece of flying technology ever built. Instead, it offers something far less flashy, but far more disruptive: control. Saab isn't just offering aircraft. It's offering Canada the keys, full technology transfer, domestic production, software access, the ability to modify, upgrade, and deploy without asking for permission. This is where the conversation shifts from defense hardware to national leverage. Because once you move past the headlines, the Gripen story becomes less about dogfights and more about economics, industry, and long-term autonomy. According to publicly available information, Saab has committed to building a complete fighter jet production capability inside Canada. Not a token assembly line, not a screwdriver factory, a full production ecosystem, including airframes, avionics integration, testing, and delivery. That single promise changes everything. It would make Canada the only country in the Western Hemisphere capable of producing next-generation fighter aircraft. Analysts estimate this could generate between 15 and 25,000 high-skilled jobs directly. Aerospace engineers, software specialists, advanced manufacturing technicians. And that's just the beginning. Every job inside aerospace tends to create 3 or 4 more across the supply chain. Training, logistics, materials, research. Suddenly, companies like Bombardier, CAE, and dozens of smaller firms aren't just suppliers. They become part of a strategic industrial network. The financial impact compounds quickly. Instead of tens of billions flowing south to U.S. primes and subcontractors, a significant portion of that money circulates inside Canada. Taxes, salaries, local investment. Economists refer to this as the multiplier effect. Each dollar spent domestically generates far more value over time than money spent abroad. But even that understates the real price, because the most valuable export in modern defense isn't metal. It's knowledge. Saab's proposal includes something that Lockheed Martin simply cannot offer: full access to the aircraft's source code. In practical terms, this means Canada would control its own fighter systems at the deepest level. No waiting for foreign approval to integrate new weapons. No external veto on software upgrades. No hidden restrictions triggered by political disagreements. The Royal Canadian Air Force could adapt the aircraft to its own doctrine, its own geography, and its own strategic priorities. That kind of control transforms how a military plans for the future. It turns procurement from a one-time purchase into a long-term capability. And it matters more than ever because Canada's defense challenges don't look like those of most NATO countries. Canada isn't defending dense urban borders or compact territory. It's responsible for the largest Arctic domain on Earth, vast distances, extreme cold, sparse infrastructure. And that environment punishes aircraft that rely on pristine runways and complex maintenance chains. This is where the Gripen's design philosophy starts to look less unconventional and more tailor-made. Sweden built the Gripen with one core assumption. In a real conflict, large air bases don't last long. So the aircraft had to operate from short runways, highways, and dispersed locations with minimal support. Cold weather starts. hardened systems, rapid turnaround times. These features weren't marketing choices. They were survival requirements. Defense observers have pointed out that this aligns almost perfectly with the dispersed operations doctrine NATO itself is now developing. Instead of concentrating aircraft at a handful of vulnerable bases, air power is spread across dozens of smaller sites. In Canada's Arctic, that could mean operating from remote strips, temporary runways, or reinforced frozen surfaces. The Gripen was built for exactly that kind of flexibility. Then there's the issue few politicians like to talk about publicly: cost per flight hour. Public estimates place the Gripen's operating cost around $8,000 per hour. The F-35, depending on configuration and support structure, ranges from $35,000 to nearly $50,000. Over the life of the fleet, that difference isn't marginal. It's massive. With the same budget, Canada could fly Gripens 3 or 4 times more often. And flight hours matter. They translate directly into pilot skill, readiness, and confidence. An aircraft that's theoretically superior, but rarely flown, loses its edge quickly. Maintenance tells a similar story. Saab advertises that a Gripen can be turned around by a small team in about an hour, rearmed, refueled, back in the air. In high-tempo Arctic patrol scenarios, that speed can mean the difference between maintaining control of airspace or falling behind. Of course, critics point out the obvious. The Gripen isn't a stealth jet in the same class as the F-35, and that's true. But warfare isn't static. In environments saturated with radar, electronic warfare can be as powerful as invisibility. The Gripen carries one of the most advanced electronic warfare suites in service, designed to jam, deceive, and blind opposing sensors. Some analysts argue that in Arctic conditions, this capability may be just as effective as pure stealth, if not more so. None of this happens in isolation. A Canadian decision to move away from the F-35 would send ripples through Washington. The U.S. has invested heavily in standardizing Allied air forces around a single platform. A Canadian departure wouldn't just be a procurement shift. It would be a political signal. Initial reactions could be tense, but defense experts note that NORAD and NATO interoperability depend far more on communications and data sharing than on identical airframes. The Gripen was designed to operate within NATO networks from the beginning. Link 16, real-time data sharing, integrated command structures. And perhaps, most importantly, it opens the door to weapons diversification. European systems like the Meteor air-to-air missile, often rated superior in range and precision to its American counterparts. The Iris-T for close combat. Anti-ship options tailored to northern waters. Over time, this reduces dependence on any single supplier. This is where speculation begins to surface. Some observers believe a Canadian Gripen decision could quietly encourage other mid-sized nations to reconsider their own strategies. Poland has already shown interest in operating multiple fighter types. The Baltic states are watching dispersed operations closely. If a G7 country demonstrates that autonomy and alliance membership aren't mutually exclusive, it changes the conversation inside NATO. The long-term implications are even more striking. Picture Canada in 2045, a domestic fighter production line still running. Canadian engineers leading upgrades, universities collaborating on artificial intelligence, cyber defense, and electronic warfare research tied directly into operational aircraft. Intellectual property generated at home. Talent retained instead of exported. Canada not just buying security, but producing it. And then there's the hardest benefit to measure: freedom of action. In an unstable world, the ability to make defense decisions without external approval is a form of power. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't appear in budgets, but it shapes outcomes. It means upgrades happen when Canada decides they should. Deployments occur on Canada's timeline. Strategy is defined by national interest, not negotiated access. This path isn't without risk. Diplomatic friction is real. So is the challenge of proving that a more independent approach delivers on its promises. Choosing autonomy over convenience demands confidence and patience. But history tends to favor nations willing to invest early in their own capabilities. Sweden did it throughout the Cold War. South Korea did it by building indigenous industries instead of relying solely on imports. Those decisions pay dividends decades later. So this moment isn't really about jets. It's about identity, about whether Canada sees itself primarily as a participant in someone else's system, or as a partner capable of standing on its own technological and industrial foundation. 88 aircraft can't define a nation on their own, but the choices attached to them can echo for generations. Because in the end, the real question isn't whether Canada can afford the Gripen. It's whether Canada is willing to invest in a future where sovereignty isn't something granted by allies, but something actively maintained. When security and independence pull in different directions, the decision reveals what a country truly values. And whatever choice Ottawa makes, the world will be watching closely, not for the aircraft, but for what that choice says about power in the modern age. This content is analytical in nature, based on publicly available information, and does not represent any official position of any government, military, or organization.